With chapter 6, we get into the modern period, which starts at about 1600 AD. During this week and the next, we'll be looking into modern intellectual developments that contributed to the birth of psychology. In chapter 6, specifically, we focus on empiricism, associationism, and utilitarianism. Let's begin with empiricism. Empiricism is derived from empirikos in Greek and empiricus in Latin, both of which roughly mean experience. So empiricism places great importance on observation and experience. Last week, when we discussed peer-reviewed studies, I mentioned conducting the study, which is then submitted to a journal in an empirical manner. This means that the researcher isn't an armchair researcher, which is a term that describes people who sit back and theorize. But in this case, the researcher is actually conducting studies to observe the effects and then write about them. But talking about empiricism and empirical studies in that matter is much more of a modern concept. What we're referring to when we talk about empiricism in the 16th century is the idea that experiences we have contribute to our knowledge, and that reason comes from experience. That we're talking about the fact that we're not born with a knowledge base. That's really what empiricism in this time frame is talking about. Francis Bacon, whose Four Idols theory is the subject of your group project this week, is a top figure in modern empiricism. So we've got to talk about him when we talk about empiricism. He is best known for pioneering the scientific method. So I'm sure you've heard a lot about the scientific method. Descartes, Darwin, Locke, and Newton all acknowledged his contribution, all acknowledged Francis Bacon's contribution to their work. So you know that what he had to say was really quite important and really changed the paradigm. He dedicated his work to exploring human knowledge, essentially epistemology. He focused on the common sources of errors in our quest for knowledge, and these are the four idols, some of which reflect the weakness of human intellect, in Bacon's opinion, and some of which are affected by social forces. These four idols are the idols of the tribe. These are the limits of the human intellectual apparatus. So here what we're talking about is how we take in information and individual interpretation of that information. Then you have idols of the cave, which are the prejudices or preferred theories that blind us to alternative explanations. So things that we've read, our experiences, and the qualities that make us individuals. And then you have idols of the marketplace, which are aspects of the normal fallacy. And here, these are the words we use to communicate and how they influence our understanding. And then lastly, we have idols of the theater, which are tendencies of humans to accept the claims of authorities. So essentially, this is the paradigm in which we live. So these are the four idols of Francis Bacon, and we'll talk a little bit more about them in class as we prepare for you to work on your project. Next, what we have is John Locke. He is most closely associated with the term tabula rasa. I'm sure that you've heard that before. Or what that means is blank slate. What this means is that he concluded that babies are born with no prior knowledge and acquire everything through experience. So you can think of this as 100% nurture, and that nature plays no role. And this is in terms of nature versus nurture debate. What we talk about when we talk about Locke is also the primary and secondary qualities, and these describe the nature of reality. Essentially, what he was talking about is that the primary qualities are the physical realm, and secondary qualities are more subjective. As I mentioned before, Bacon and Locke, too, applied empiricism to epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. Now, George Berkeley applied it to ontology, which is the theory of the nature of being, or the nature of existence. He challenged Locke's materialism and advocated a return to spiritual interpretations of the world. To him, the distinction between primary and secondary qualities, as Locke had suggested, they were unclear. They weren't as clear cut as all that. He raised the question that if we base our knowledge on experience, how do we not experience and talk about the primary qualities if not through our senses, which then kind of come right back to the beginning and fall into the realm of secondary qualities? So these were the questions that he was asking. Thus, Berkeley suggested that the existence is defined as being perceived, and that the only real world is that of experience. This is also suggested to him because there is so much consistency, even when something isn't being necessarily perceived, that there must be a continual outside perceiver, which he suggested is God. Berkeley's belief that to be is to be perceived is different from solipsism, which maintains that the only sure existence is that of our own mind. Berkeley's belief is in an outside observer, a permanent God, which then prevents solipsism because it requires one to acknowledge that he isn't the perceiver. Now, I know this sounds a little confusing, and I think as you read your text, all of this will fall a little bit more into place, but I just wanted to get you thinking about this as you look at the PowerPoints and get you ready to read about this in the text. Now, all of these conversations about perception and whether it's physical or subjective are still being explored today in the field of cognition or cognitive psychology. So even though these conversations originally, or these theories were taking place several hundred years ago, the topics which are at the root of the content are still quite timely and quite appropriate for what we're studying today. Now, moving on, David Hume was interested in the causality of human nature. He focused on the role of experience, but he emphasized that it is what we see and we attribute to things that imbues them with causal significance. He also applied an empirical approach to understanding mental life. Let me put it that way. He distinguished between impressions and fainter impressions, which he then called ideas. So, Hume distinguished, let's move on to the next slide there. Hume argued that ourselves and our experiences are not as continuous as we would like to believe. He said that our experiences may be more like a system, more like a disjointed parade than a single coherent system. He studied the emotions extensively, and he advocated comparative studies in physical anatomy and the anatomy of the mind. So stop and think about that for just a moment. When we get into talking about the anatomy of the mind, we see that Hume had a real concern and a focus on psychological issues and topics, though there wasn't a formal study of the discipline yet. And as we talk about Hume and look back at Locke and Berkeley and Bacon as well, we can group all of these thinkers together and term them British empiricists. They're really credited as the founders of empirical philosophy, but there were other contributors as well, and we can't leave them out. Two that were worthy of particular note are Etienne Benoit de Cadillac and Claude Adrien Levacheus. Um, these two added to the theories that the perhaps more famous or more well recognized British empiricists had proposed. And then moving on, we look at associationism and utilitarianism. The focus on empiricism in the 16th and 17th century inspired the latter philosophers in the 18th and 19th century to ask questions about the way that knowledge is acquired. Once you accept that knowledge is acquired through experience, it then follows that the process through which this occurs should be studied and explored as well. This is where associationism and utilitarianism come from. David Hartley is regarded as the founder of associationism, which is the theory that all mental processes operate by association of discrete experiences that combine. This is essentially a precursor to the study of memory, particularly because Hartley also had an interest and he had a medical practice besides writing. That's what he did. He was a practicing doctor, essentially. Thus, he proposed a neurophysiological system of association. And that's the very beginning and the basis of memory and the study of memory. Now, associationism also extended to the social arena with a focus on actions and their consequences. Jeremy Bentham argued for a utilitarian approach to the practice of law, to the practice of jurisprudence. He accepted psychological hedonism, which is the idea that humans seek pleasure and avoid pain. Now, if this sounds familiar, you're right, because we're going to revisit this idea again when we talk about behaviorism and behavioral modification, in particular when we talk about B.F. Skinner. So kind of mark this down for yourself, and we'll come back to it in a couple of weeks. And then to this point, the discussion of the role of women and their perspective has really been silent. We haven't really talked much about women when we've talked about empiricism. However, Mary Wollstonecraft challenged the status quo of women at the time, suggesting that if, as Locke had proposed, babies are born with a blank slate, with a tabula rasa, then it's the differences. Then the differences between men and women must come from their differing experiences. So it really has to do with the environment that they're brought up in. It has to do with the different opportunities that are available to them. Thus, the differences are due to the nurture and not the nature, which at the time was really, really a very different, outside of the box type of thinking. Now we kind of take that for granted, but at the time, this was very radical because women and men were thought to be completely different, and there were just certain things that women were never going to be able to do because they were women. We think of all of that quite differently now. Mary Wollstonecraft's book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, encouraged women to acquire that strength, and it encouraged men to seek fellowship with women as equals, which we propose. We're all proponents of today, but at the time, like I said, this was very, very different and very radical. Then lastly, in chapter 6, we'll look at James and John Mill, who are father and son. James Mill was a colleague and a friend of Jeremy Bentham and expanded both Bentham's and Hartley's work on utilitarianism and associationism, respectively, obviously. He focused very rigorously on promoting a stern and businesslike atmosphere for cognitive learning for his children, particularly for John Mill, who was his first son, his first child, actually. This, of course, as you might imagine, had a significant impact on John Mill, not only in terms of his knowledge base, but also on his own attitudes and work. Um, John Stuart Mill viewed the mind in probabilistic terms rather than mechanical terms. He maintained that a science of psychology was possible. He suggested a science of the development of character, which he called ethologue. He also, perhaps due in part to his relationship with Harriet Taylor, about whom you'll read in your textbook, advocated feminist views. So here's another person that's going against the grain of the time and advocating for women. He grounded these views in his empiricism and his utilitarianism, and he suggested that there would be societal benefits from providing women with opportunity. So, again, this is somebody who is championing the female cause. With these intellectual developments, and here we'll go back to the last slide here, particularly with the work of early empiricisms, the stage was being set for psychology to emerge as a discrete discipline. In Chapter 7, we'll look at how rationalism furthered this along. So this is the end of Chapter 6, and your next video is going to be talking about Chapter 7 and rationalism.